there, guys. So this right here is one of those moves that I always take for granted as something that people need to work on. This is an extension, right? And the reason that I usually take that for granted is because it is such a simple move. It literally is just your arm and your poi forming one continuous line that goes around in a circle, right? And it's one of those things like static spin that you almost have to wonder why there's a name for it. But I was recently reminded of why specifically it's helpful, which is that a lot of us in the first couple years that we're spinning, we're learning tricks like weaves and thread the needles and crossers and things like that. And while these are all beautiful moves, they have an unintended and sometimes negative side effect. And I see this popping up time and time again with beginners, which is that they train you into a kind of bad habit that you have to break later on. And I know this because they trained me in this habit, and I had to break this habit. It took me a couple years to get there. Namely, when you think of poi movement in this way, what's happening is that you're minimizing the movements in your arms. It almost gets to the point where you think so much about the movement of the poi that your arms get folded into your body like a bird's do when they're walking around on the ground, when they're not flying, right? And you're actually like trying to minimize the presence of your arms entirely as you do this. And this trains you to start working at moving the poi almost completely from your hand and your wrist. Now, don't get me wrong, there's many cases where you do have to move the poi essentially from your hand and your wrist, and good playing control really does come from there. However, once you start getting into more like immediate level tricks, like say, getting into poi flowers and the like, or, you know, things like anti-spin flowers, caps, etc., all of a sudden something different happens with how you're trying to get the poi to move, which is that the basis of movement is no longer getting your hand and your wrist to move the poi, but getting the poi to be an extension of your hand and wrist, yeah? Which is part of what's interesting about the name. I think when we talk about extensions, we usually think about extending the movement of the poi as far as we can in all directions, when really from kind of a biomechanical standpoint, this is all about making the movement of the poi an extension of the movement of your hand and arm, right? So any kind of movements that you can do with your hands and arms then, the poi wind up being kind of an exaggerated version of. And just about any kind of movement you can do where you're taking up more room, these really beautiful flowers and hybrids and things like that, they all require you to treat the poi as an extension of your hands and your arms, right? So basically, this is one of those things that I recommend y'all start training yourself out of almost as soon as you possibly can. Even as you're a beginner, when you're doing things like a thread the needle, a lot of us learn this as, say, big arm movements that we then shrink down into small arm movements. And that's fine. The small arm movements look quite beautiful in and of themselves, but to not let go of that big arm place, you know? In fact, what I would say is a great way to begin to train yourself out of this is actually just to take each of the different timing and direction combinations. That is, together same, together opposite, split time opposite, and of course, split time same direction, and just begin drilling those in an extension kind of place. And it's easy enough to start off. You just have your hands do the actions. That is, you kind of imagine you're holding a bowl, and you turn your hands around in a big circle like this for together same time. And then you do the same thing with the poi. And what will inevitably happen the first few times you do this is you're going to find something wonky happening. Either the poi never quite gets across the top like that, or you'll do something like making an extra circle because your hand just cannot believe for the life of it that its job is not to make the poi keep on turning, but it's not. It's now coming from your shoulder. So if you're having that problem that the poi is going limp up top, then what you need to do is, I guess, turn it a bit faster so that the centrifugal force from the poi going outward is always keeping it rigid like this. If you slow it down, what happens is it goes limp over the top, right? And likewise, if you find yourself doing an extra circle with your hand, try relaxing it. Try just letting it go slower and really figure out how slow you can possibly get this movement across the top before it does start to go limp. And there you'll find that kind of comfortable range wherein you can do those extensions, right? So again, we practice that in together same. And we go back to our thread the needles and do them from a fully extended place. In together opposite. Then we do split time opposites, right? Which a lot of people, when I first show them this, they want to kind of minimize it down to this place, once again, where their hands are responsible for the movement and not their shoulders. And really, truly, you're doing yourself a disservice if this is the only way that you're practicing it. Really, really, really reach out and try and eat up some space with it, you know? It's going to be hard at first, especially if you're used to that, my hand and wrist are responsible for all the poi movement kind of place, but it does you so many favors to be able to get to this place sooner. And of course, finally, coming at it from a place where you're doing the crawl stroke with your poi, you know, in split time, same direction. So start drilling these sooner rather than later, and what you'll find is that moves that tend to eat up more room and have more freedom of movement to them, such as flowers or hybrids like this, will come to you much easier, that you won't have to force them in order to make them come out. In fact, one of the beauties of using poi in this way is that it actually takes a lot less energy to spin overall. It takes a lot less concentration, and ultimately, I think it looks more beautiful in the long run. So, yeah, that is extensions in a nutshell. If you guys are in your first or second year of spinning poi, I cannot recommend getting into this early enough. It will prepare you for stuff that are many, many years down the road in ways that you can't possibly imagine. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and I will be back with another tutorial for you next week. Thanks for watching, and peace.